visiting with us. It's great to have you. Do stay afterwards for a tea or a coffee. I'm sorry, no bickies, COVID and all that sort of stuff. So, but we do have hot drinks and a chance to catch up with you. For those who are visiting, we're working our way through 1 Corinthians, and we're moving into a new section where Paul is focusing in on the public worship of the church at Corinth. They seem to be a bit of a rambunctious lot. They seem to be able to create problems where none should exist. But maybe it's a gifting of yours as well. We have something for primary age kids, do we, Fran?
That's right, yes.
Okay, so primary age kids, teenager, sorry, just stuck. And so in the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at the way in which Paul is addressing some of the issues. And Ryan, in his graciousness, gave me this passage when he broke it up. It's all about ladies and hats. So my title is "Keep Your Hat On?" Question mark. Okay, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting at verse 2 through to 16. Paul says, "I am so glad that you always keep me in your thoughts, and that you are following the teachings I passed on to you. But there is one thing I want you to know. The head of every man is Christ. The head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. A man dishonours his head if he covers his head while praying or prophesying. But a woman dishonours her head if she prays or prophesies without a covering on her head. For that is the same as shaving her head. Yes, if she refuses to wear a head covering, she should cut off all her hair. But since it is shameful for a woman to have her hair cut or a head shaved, she should wear a covering. A man should not wear anything on his head when worshipping, for man is made in God's image and reflects God's glory, and woman reflects man's glory. For the first man didn't come from woman, but the first woman came from man. And man was not made for woman, but woman was made for man. For this reason, and because the angels are watching, a woman should wear a covering on her head to show she is under authority. But among the Lord's people, women are not independent of men, and men are not independent of women. For although the first woman came from man, every man was born from a woman. Every other man was born from a woman, and everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it right for a woman to pray to God in public without covering her head? Isn't it obvious that it's a disgrace for a man to have long hair? And isn't long hair a woman's pride and joy? For it has been given to her as a covering. But if anyone wants to argue about this, I simply say that we have no other custom than this, and neither do God's other churches. As we are all aware, fashions change, not always for the better. In the 1970s, I was in my late teens and 20s, and this is how the fashion-conscious ladies dressed at the time. Now, you notice that you had flares that had to go from the tip of your shoes to the back of your shoe. And ladies, I'm sure you would love to wear socks like that today. Come on. Who's jealous? And the pantsuits. I wonder why they went out of fashion. But men, you weren't left out. Now that's wearing shorts. Who remembers shorts? Real shorts, yeah. Now come on, time for confession, guys. Hand up. Who still has a pair of walk socks? Or they all burnt. And the flares. And the jumpers. I tried finding a picture of a safari suit with shorts. So you had a safari suit jacket and the shorts and the walk socks. But I think they've all been expunged from the internet. I do not understand why. We're waiting for it to come back. Thanks, Sarah, just to a blank. But it's not only the style of dress that changes, but also the meaning of style. Because in a culture, what you wear usually means something. So in my youth, anyone turning up to a public event with holes in their clothes would have been told to go home and get changed and come back dressed properly. Yes, we got a few. And a t-shirt hanging out or a shirt hanging out was considered slovenly and you were being disrespectful. And everyone wore socks that were pulled up. I saw one website that proudly proclaimed 5 types of socks and how to wear them. Well, I got one pair of socks and I put them on. No, things change. This passage from Paul is one of those that's really difficult to nail down categorically. And typically it varies in interpretation from absolutely literal, that women must always wear a head covering, through to being disregarded as just a local cultural issue for Paul's time and has no bearing for us whatsoever today. Yet it's part of the scriptures, and what's interesting is Paul is anchoring his argument to the order of creation and not just some limited cultural commentary. And so we need to take it seriously and start to work out, okay, what does he say? What is he meaning? Now, if you go back a few generations, I've got a picture there of 1920s. All ladies would have worn a hat any time they went out in public, and so did men. I remember my grandmother, even when she was going down the street, would put on the hat and off she would go. And ladies always wore hats to church. We would play with my mum's gloves when we got bored in church, because the ladies always wore hats and gloves. And men always wore a hat when they went out. You see the guys there, even the boys. Actually, his mum's hat. The guy's got the cloth cap on at the front. And a man would always take his hat off when he went inside. That was the cultural practice of the day. And so this passage wasn't very problematic because it just fitted in with what was culturally happening and no one had to worry about it or think about it. But how do we make sense of this passage today, when really the only place you're likely to see ladies in Western culture wearing something on their heads is when they go to the races? And it's, oh, look at me. No, I paid $1,000 for this. What? Left the price tag on. What about other cultural settings, both now and historically? In some places in Melanesia where we were, you could go to a church service today where the people would be wearing so little that if they turned up here, they'd be arrested. So what sense does it make for them to put something on their heads? They're virtually wearing nothing else. Now, rather than try to wrestle to the ground all the specific things Paul says here, I want to concentrate on the big picture. Now, you jumped there a bit, Sarah. Just go to a blank. Look at the big picture and the purpose of what he is saying and how that's applied to his time and how we can bring it forward into our own time or into any historical or cultural setting. What we need to start with is to remind ourselves of Paul's reason for writing these verses and then the following passages that we'll look at in the coming weeks, because they are addressing a significant shortcoming in the way that the Corinthian church was conducting its public worship. At heart, worship has to be about God, who he is, what he does, and our proper response to him. Worship is not about us, nor is it the opportunity for us to use a social setting to pursue some other personal objective, whether it's about getting noticed, everybody thinking I'm important, gaining favour by noticing other people. Oh, you're looking lovely today, dear. And no, I don't say grease talking, that's pidgin English. No, fluffing somebody else up so that you're gaining influence with them, or getting my own needs met in some way. The public worship in the Corinthian church was not honouring God, nor helping the people who came to come to him in worship and praise and confession and thanksgiving. And so in this passage and the ones that follow that we'll look at in the following weeks, Paul lays down some guidelines to get things back into order not for the sake of order, but for the sake of the focus being on God, who is to be worshipped. The other significant part of the context we need to remember is that Corinth was a melting pot of different cultures, languages and religions. There were Greek, there were Roman, there were Jewish. Then there was a bit of tribal in there as well as Christian subcultures thrown in. Many commentators have sought to suggest that there was a universal practice regarding head coverings in Greek and Roman Jewish cultures at the time. That when people go back to look at what was being written by the commentators of the day, when they look at what was drawn on things like pottery and in frescoes, there seems to be no universal practice at all. There's no evidence for one common way of doing things. Now, if you went back several centuries, to 2 or 4 BC, particularly for the Romans, there was a practice of the married women to cover their heads when in public. But by Paul's day, this practice is getting quite patchy. And in his day, the Jewish women likely covered their heads, but also their faces as well with a veil. No, they wrap it across, and I don't know how they did it. So a bit more like you see in Islam these days. That's how the Jewish women would go out. Even in the religious ceremonies, the pagan practices varied quite a lot. Though some of the commentators note that in some of the mystery religions that the Romans followed, now mystery religion is one where you had a god, and they didn't tell you about the god until you were inducted, and then they'd tell you the mysteries, and you know all the secret knowledge. That's why they're called mystery religions. But in some of those, the women worshipping with their heads uncovered was quite the thing in some of them. And so they make a bit of a jump, or maybe this was fashionable in Corinth at the time, and some of the fashionable Christian ladies were doing what was happening, and they were coming to service and participating without their heads covered. But from what Paul says, we can infer that some women were taking leading parts in the public worship. They're standing, they're praying, they're prophesying, without having any head covering. And that was creating consternation and disruption in worship for some, maybe many other Christians who were part of the congregation. So what's the big idea here? The principle that Paul is wanting the Corinthian Christians to get hold of, and therefore for us as well. It's more than just having a lump of material on someone's head and not someone else's. It's about what the cultural practice of head covering means to the people who are participating in that worship setting. Paul talks of short hair being shameful for women in verse 6, but it doesn't have that meaning for us or many other cultures at all. Down through the centuries, many people have worn many strange and curious things on their head. And if you ever watched any Chinese or Korean historical dramas, boy, they have some amazing things stuck on their heads. And we think, why in the world? But it meant something very important. It was about status or role. And then we've got those ladies, I think Middle European somewhere, I'm not sure which culture, very different to what we would wear. What is significant is not the hat itself, but what it represents to the people who are wearing it and to those who are seeing it. It's conveying cultural meaning in that setting. Its cultural significance is the important thing. In Paul's day, within the Christian subculture, the practice of head covering for women when they were taking part in public worship indicated respect and an acceptable social order within the gathering, so that it didn't distract people away from the true object of their worship, which was Jesus. Paul actually argues from creation that there is a divine order and respect in relationships, which allow those relationships to be properly aligned, mutually respectful, and accountable to each other. In verses 2 and 3 he says, But there is one thing I want you to know. The head of every man is Christ, the head of every woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Now we should make some comment on the word translated as head in English, because it has meanings often in our thinking that it weren't there in the original Greek. The Greek connotation of the idea of head is probably best comes out in the English translation, or the English usage, head of the river. Not the boss of the river, but the head of, they're like the spring, the source, the origin of a river, rather than the idea of head of state, which is all about authority and position and power. It has that idea of source and origin as its main motif, rather than the idea of authority. Now, this is evident in this description of God being the head of Christ, because we know they're both equal, but the scriptures also say Christ is the only begotten Son of the Father. There's no subordination that Jesus is a lesser God than the Father. There's no difference in status or value, but there's a difference in function. In a harmonious relationship, they function differently. The Son proceeding from the Father and submitting to the Father's will in love, not because he's lesser. And so that's the context of this idea of headship. So the creation order is also that man is created by God through Christ, and that woman is formed as part of man. In these series of relationships, there is to be respect towards the one who is your source and responsibility towards the one who originates from you. And Paul is highlighting that there is appropriate social order, even within the Godhead, as demonstrated in creation. If that's the case, surely as worshipping Christians, there should be social order, respectful relationships with each other when we come together to worship God. If God is well ordered socially and respectfully, surely we should mirror that when we are together as his people. Now, this idea and the way he explains it out of creation often gets quite a reaction from modern Westerners, because we interpret it with our Western cultural mindset and don't just take Paul for what he's saying. In Western cultures, we always assign status and value to function. So we have a status for a bricklayer or a politician or a student, whatever. And as soon as we get a different function, we assume a different status. And then because women, men, Jesus, God are all assigned different functions and statuses, we get upset and think somehow they aren't worthy of each other. But that's not what Paul's saying. Paul is very clear that there is no value differentiation here between men and women, just as there is no value differentiation between father and son. In verse 11 and 12 he says, "But among the Lord's people, women are not independent of men, and men are not independent of women. For although the first woman came from man, every other man was born from a woman, and everything comes from God." The other more recent reaction to this passage, you probably aren't feeling it here, but you'll certainly hear it in social commentary, is that there are only two genders mentioned, male and female. And this is offensive to those who have a multi-gender view. However, the scriptures only ever speak of humans as male and female, as created by God. We live in a physically and socially sin-broken world, so there will very occasionally be people with a physical mix of gender or a mixed emotional understanding of themselves. However, these rare exceptions do not determine the God-intended reality. Exceptions are to be cared for with grace and compassion and social understanding, but you do not reprogram your whole understanding of social truth on the basis of an exception. If I can give a less loaded example, many of us have food sensitivities. I've got quite a few, as do others in the congregation. Now, if we all got together and said that it's insensitive and disrespectful for the supermarkets to sell what we cannot eat, and we should remove from the supermarkets everything we can't eat. The only thing that would be left on the supermarket shelf would be tofu. No, that's soy. Some people react to soy. That's gone as well. Sorry. Now, that's just crazy. Any society that tries to define what it does by exceptions quickly disintegrates and loses social order and common purpose. And so we shouldn't be doing that when it comes to gender dysphoria, dysfunction and so on. So let's go back to the main argument. Paul's application of this pattern of divine order and respect, as evidenced by God in himself and displayed in how he created, is being used by him to point the Corinthian Christians to the common Christian practice of his day, which harmonised across all these different cultures, Roman, Greek, Jewish, tribal. Women covered their heads when participating in public worship. This prevented distraction and offence and allowed the worship to be properly focused on Jesus and the people's response to him. This appropriate use of order and respect in worship is needed in every cultural setting, but how it is expressed will be different in every setting and will change over time. Now, a generation ago, even in other cultures, I'll go back to the Melanesian one, if you went to a village in rural PNG, all the women would sit on one side, I can't remember if it was left or right, and all the men would sit on the other. And all the kids would go with the ladies. Because they didn't have nappies. As cultural patterns have changed over time, they now have mixed congregations because that men and women separation no longer has cultural significance or meaning, and so their worship patterns have changed. We sit back and say, oh yeah, fair enough. Every culture changes over time, and so ours, as I said before, I can remember sitting in church and looking at all the ladies' hats and playing with mum's gloves, and it doesn't mean what it did then. Now our culture has changed. But in every culture and every subculture, those who belong to it know when someone is pushing the boundaries rebelliously or in a self-serving way. Whether they say, look at me, look at me. No, go back to the Melanesian one, for instance. In our time there, women would never wear trousers, never wear jeans or slacks. And I remember one young lady came back from university and she was proudly walking around in her jeans, and all the locals were getting very upset. Now, she was doing it very deliberately and rebelliously. It wasn't just accidental. She knew exactly what she was doing. Men and women never had physical touch in public. And if they did, it was deliberate and rebellious. So you know when someone walks in and they're saying, look at me, or, I think you're a mob of whatevers, and I'm not going to dress appropriately, and I'm going to show you how annoyed I am. Okay, how many teenagers have got up and dressed just to annoy their mum? That never happened, did it? I recall watching a documentary on Japan where the big rebel in the school was hauled away for questioning by the powers that be because he wore white socks. And the whole school was aghast. Now to us, what? But in that cultural context, everybody knew what it meant. And so it's understanding the meaning of what the clothing has that is important. In Paul's day, it was the use of head coverings, which symbolised respectful relationships and order in worship. What would that be for us today? It's no longer head covering. Wearing hats means next to nothing. If you're going to see somebody with a hat on, it's probably a teenager or 20-something guy with his cap on backwards in church. not a lady. But how we choose to dress on public occasions signal to others what we are thinking about ourselves or them. We can tell when makeup and hairstyle are yelling, "Look at me," or when the lack of care says, "You're insignificant and I'm telling you that." Here the focus, of course, is on Christians who are taking part in public worship in some way and coming together. It's not on a non-Christian or an outsider who comes in off the street. We just accept them as they are because they are not there participating in the worship as was happening in this context. Our attire signals to others that we are present to worship and not for some other personal agenda to offend or to attract. Our attire signals that we are primary with other Christians to worship God and not to distract them from doing the same. Our attire signals to others our respect for them, our willingness to relate in socially appropriate ways. How we dress and conduct ourselves reveal what the heart purpose we have in being part of that group. In Corinth, they've got away from that clear understanding of having a central focus on God and have become too concerned about doing things how they wanted, making the most out of their social statements. Look how progressive we are. Look what rah-rah-rah. They were using worship for their own purposes, and Paul was pulling them back into line. Paul calls them and us to always be mindful that we have order and respect in worship so that God alone is honoured in our time together. Now, it's probably not a major issue for us that we all go to suddenly change and come to church in three-piece suits and all that. But we need to keep it in mind because it's one of those drift things that over time a group together starts to drift away from having God as the central focus of their worship. They start doing other stuff. As we prepare heart and mind to come to worship each week, make sure that God is our focus, that we are not here to distract other people, but together we can honour Him and worship Him as the primary one who is high in our hearts. Let's pray. Lord, it's interesting that this is part of our scriptures. You are not high and holy and distant from our cultural practice. You want to be embedded in the everyday, in how we express ourselves to each other and to you within each and every culture. And so you give us principles by which we can do that. We thank you that you are present and active in the world in which we live. Help us to be mindful of you and caring of each other in the way we come to worship, in the way we help each other focus our hearts on you, to honour you by who we are together as your worshipping people. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to close off with a song and I'll hand back over to Ryan. Let's stand a second.